welcome to everyone today at the 2025 edition of the Understanding China Conference. I'm David Orlandi, EU Partnership Manager for EU SME Centre, and I will be your MC today throughout the conference. Before we start with the next session, I would like to briefly also address the online audience and recall to all of you that despite not being able to be here physically in Brussels, we very much appreciate your participation today. So I warmly invite you to write your questions in the Q&A box inside the Zoom platform so that we will have the chance to address also questions not only from the audience, but also online throughout the panel sessions and Q&A moments at the end of each segment. So without further ado, I would like to move on to the first session of this conference. The first item that we are going to address today is potentially what is mostly interesting for most of you today, an update on EU-China relations. 2025 is a complex year, as we've heard and know, and we wanted to assess from different angles, different perspectives, what is the outlook, what are we looking at for EU-China relations. So to this end, we've devised a panel that takes into account multiple views. Allow me to very briefly introduce all of the speakers that will be joining us today in this session. We have, first of all, Ms. Alexandra Kozlova-Daboska from the Far East Unit, team leader for the Far East, China team leader for the Far East Unit at the DG Trade European Commission. Mr. François Godement, Special Advisor Asia and America from the Institut Montaigne, and Hongjian, the Director for the Department for European Studies, China Institute of International Studies. We will be welcoming both on-site and online participants today as speakers. So we will also invite all of you today to focus to both components. And once again, since it is a hybrid format, make sure to write your questions online. So without further ado, I would like to welcome on stage the first speaker today. So Ms. Alexandra Kozlowska, you're welcome on stage. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and maybe reflect collectively what does it mean to do business in China this year. And I think that the release of one of the consortium partners, the EU CCC report this morning about Chinese role in supply chains, could not be more timely. So if you have not read the report this morning, I really invite you to read it, because this report offers a very sober assessment of China's dominant role in global supply chains, in growing geopolitical, regulatory, and economic risks that really shape the environment in which European companies operate today, not only in China, but globally. So when I read the report, the message is clear. China remains indispensable. It's not wise, it's not economically viable to decouple from China. Nobody wants this. So I can only echo what Liam said before. This is not the objective. But China also remains increasingly unpredictable, prompting companies and governments alike to prioritize diversification and resilience over pure cost efficiency. So I was invited today to tell you what is the state of the EU-China relations. And I must say that the relations are undergoing a very turbulent state. It has been already this case for a couple of past years. And I think that my boss, President von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, rightly summarized this when she was in Beijing in July, that the EU-China relations are at the inflection point. Without any doubt, China is the only global manufacturing superpower. The share of containerized exports reached 36% last year. You compare this with 31 5 years ago. Amazing growth, huh? But also, China is responsible for huge imbalances of global trade. Look only at the EU-China trade balance. China has a 305 billion surplus over the EU when we look at the last year. And I think, looking at the numbers for the first 10 months of this year, we are going for another record. Why I give you these boring numbers? Because I want to show that these imbalances are structural. Why they are structural? China now accounts for 36% of global manufacturing output. But at the same time, they are only responsible for 13% of consumption. So there is a clear mismatch between what they produce and what they are able to consume. This production must be directed somewhere. If this cannot be consumed in China, it has to be directed through exports to overseas markets. Europe is one of the obvious candidates, while, for example, the US market, to get there, is getting a little bit more difficult after the Liberation Day. What is more is that China's domestic producer price deflation makes it even more easy. And the yuan devaluation, which we can discuss if this is 40, 50 or 20%, makes it another cost advantage to Chinese exporters. But at the same time, the EU, so what is the EU? SMEs and other companies, they face persistent barriers in entering Chinese markets. Nobody knows this better than you, SMEs that are trying to enter China. These barriers are extremely wide because they range from SPS in agri-sector, procurement, pharmaceuticals, you name it. When I read the EU CCC report, I see that 70% of European companies in China report worsening business conditions in China for last year. So this is all happening against the backdrop of extremely volatile geopolitical situation. Only since summer, we have seen the EU-China summit, the EU-US political agreement on trade, but also continued US-China negotiations and recent discussions on export controls. So these three relationships form a triangle. Definitely, this is not an equilateral one. And our ability to shape this triangle relationship will depend on how successful we are in strengthening our strategic autonomy. Now, coming back to EU-China relationship, why is it so unbalanced? I think there are two important strategic drivers behind it. One is distortive non-market policies and subsidies. There are reports that say that between 4 and 5% of Chinese GDP ends up in subsidies. So this is not a cyclical phenomenon. This is structural. How does it end? It ends in overcapacities. And these overcapacities are increasingly challenged and channeled through overseas markets. So we have seen an avalanche in sectors like electric vehicles, in steel, in critical minerals, advanced machinery, chemicals. It's really across the sectors. So this is one thing. Another thing why this relation is so much unbalanced is what I mentioned before, structural access barriers and all kinds of discriminatory policies that you, the European companies, face in China. But this is not all. An important aspect of this relationship is also weaponization of dependencies. And China has recently shown a growing readiness to use, for example, export controls and different retaliatory trade defense investigations as geopolitical instruments. The rare earths, gallium, germanium, tungsten, graphite control, cases like Nexperia, they all demonstrate new reality. And for these reasons, rebalancing and again, de-risking, not decoupling, have become an essential pillars of the EU-China policy. How can we do that? Well, if the bilateral engagement does not deliver the results that we expect, we have to rely on our autonomous instruments. What are they? Well, along the traditional trade defense instruments, we have new ones. So we have foreign subsidies regulation, we have international procurement instrument, and we have all kinds of resilience criteria, for example, in the Net Zero Industry Act. And broader measures we uncovered 2 years ago in our economic security strategy. I'll give you one example. The battery electric vehicles is really a prime example that when we act in a targeted, proportionate, and evidence-based manner to address unfair subsidization, China resorts to retaliatory responses, including 3 investigations on our agri-food products, the imposition of duties on brandy, the imposition of duties on pork, which are really unfounded and that undermine the mutual trust. I want to go back maybe a little bit to the issue of export controls, because this is the most immediate economic security concern for European industry. Just as a background, I'm sure the audience remembers that in April this year, China introduced sweeping rare earth exports controls that affected essential sectors of the EU, not only automotive, but also electronics, green goods, like windmills, for example. Then, in October, China announced even broader expansion with extraterritorial application. So, following Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi meeting, these were suspended for 1 year, so we obviously welcome this suspension, but this resolution remains only temporary and does not resolve all the underlying risks that lie beneath. What was our response? Three things. 1, fast-track licenses. Well, essential to guarantee continuation of production, but unsustainable in the long term as a model. So we pushed for general licenses for civilian use of rare earths applications, and we also upgraded our export controls, which seem to deliver for the moment, and agreed to establish a dedicated working group that would have a forum to discuss different technical issues with China. But the message that I want to convey to you today is that the world, the trade, global trade, does not end with China, because diversification and the global strategy for resilience is the way to go. And it has been a central theme of the EU economic security strategy, and I hope your own company's industry assessments. And I must admit that EU have been hyperactive this year, 25, in advancing agreements with partners like Mercosur or Mexico or India, and accelerating different negotiations across Indo-Pacific. Why do we do that? Because with these partners, we share an interest in predictable, transparent, and forcible trade rules, a commitment to rule-based order, a desire to diversify away from excessive dependencies, and a concern about the rise, might is right, approaches to trade, which obviously does not concern only China. But the diversification alone is not enough, because China's centrality in global value chains, this you can read it in the report that was released this morning, means that in many, many sectors, almost across all manufacturing sectors, we cannot substitute China without prohibitive economic costs. So what is the missing link in all these puzzles? Well, now we have to resort to building credible deterrence. Because when the dependencies cannot be eliminated, they must be managed. And this requires deterrence. So an economic relationship can only be sustainable when the other side believes that EU can and will defend its interests credibly. This is why the EU is building a more coherent economic security architecture with stronger instruments, with better surveillance of risks, with coordinated responses to coercion, and targeted use of leverage, which was identified by the heads of state and governments during the European Council. So, this is the moment of opportunity. It's a window of opportunity. The recent diplomatic signals, including this one-year pause between Trump and Xi, has opened a narrow window for engagement. But business as usual should not be an option. This cannot be an option. Because the systemic drivers of the imbalances remain in place. We see no signals from China that they will address them domestically. So, what we will do, we'll continue pressing for general licenses in export controls and predictable export control practices. We will still insist on market access and withdrawal of the 3 retaliatory trade defense cases. We will strengthen our diversification and resilience, and we will continue building Europe's economic leverage. So you could see from my speech that Europe's economic security really is shaped by many variables, including the development between US and China. But these variables we cannot control. So what we can and must control is our own capabilities. So 3 priorities stand when it comes to what we can do, is to diversify globally, so then we can play outside the triangle of US, EU, and China. We have to de-risk and we have to strengthen the economic security, including our ability to deter weaponization of dependencies. At the end, we remain open to engage with China. I cannot stress this more. We always want to talk to China to address the imbalances, because we believe that the best way to do this is inside China, not building high fences. But this engagement must be based on reciprocity, on transparency, on resilience, not our naivety. So thank you for inviting me today. Sorry for being a little bit maybe more gloomy than my predecessor, but this is how we see this from the position of Digitrade. Thank you for your attention, and I am happy to participate in a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this first speech. I would actually like to ask if you could please join us on the panel and be also joined by the moderator of this session, Esther Cañada Mela, Advocacy Manager for EU SME Centre. I also would like to ask to the speakers joining us online to open their cameras so that we can have their video screening also on the... Perfect, I see that we have everyone connected And ready. So without further ado, I would like to leave the floor for the second keynote speech of this session by Mr. François Godement. Thank you very much, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollandi, and thank you for the invitation by the EU SME Centre. I was going to say that it was going to be undiplomatic and state facts, but in fact, following what Mrs. Koslowska has said, I can only flesh out those facts, try and explain why we've come to that situation. But some of the facts have already been stated quite openly. Let's add to the pile. In 2018, late 2018 or early 2019, that is 1 year before COVID, most trade economists believed that China was on the cusp of rebalancing its economy towards internal consumption, service industry, and that somehow the export surplus would take care of itself and disappear. In fact, many people were expecting a current account deficit by China. It's the exact contrary that has happened. And even more worryingly, the trend has actually sped up and is continuing in 2025. It is certainly slowing down towards the US, which, as we know, we have a big controversy on how effective the tariffs in the US are, the interdiction or quasi-interdiction in some cases of imports are. But in any case, the official numbers are way down. But the rest of the world is suffering what one might call a tsunami of Chinese goods. Now, the term tsunami is not very nice, and we should always remember two facts. First, there are people producing these in China, and there is no denying the talent and the hard work that has gone into this. And I'm speaking of the people who work on these exports and not only of the people who decided on those policies. And second, there is clearly more than just subsidies. There are subsidies, there are coordinated policies. I'll talk about them to advantage Chinese manufactured goods. But there's also innovation, a lot of innovation, more than what most people expected. And therefore, we are facing a twin challenge. One is how to stem the tide in pure macroeconomic balance terms. But the second one is also to come up as a competitive presence on the manufacturing front, to remain significant globally on the manufacturing front. Let me first tell you that the trend, in fact, comes from afar. A lot of accent has been put on the recent years. But let's go back a lot. I'm just have enough memory to remember the mid-80s when the president of what was then the European Economic Council, the EEC, the European Economic Commission, sorry, Jacques Delors, went to Beijing, and he created a center whose purpose was to teach Chinese manufacturers and industry to export, to leave the developing status at some future time. I can still remember from the 90s, late 90s, early 20th century, speeches by the Chinese prime minister of the time. It was Mr. Wen Jiabao, usually at the spring session of the National People's Congress, saying, this can't go on, our development mode is unsustainable, we are going to get down this export glut, this export surplus, and we're going to rebalance the economy. That was almost 30 years ago. If we look at other trends, such as, for example, the so-called savings versus consumption, China is, of course, unique in the very low share of the GDP that's attributed to consumption. Now, I know, again, there are controversies because housing is not, and housing subsidies are not fully accounted in consumption. I know those fine points. But basically, this comes from very far. In China, it's not savings, it's so-called accumulation. It involves both companies and households. And it's most time, almost every year, since the PRC developed the first 5-year plan, been above 30%, sometimes up to 40%. There is a very small window in the beginning of the 80s when it went down. to something like 25%. It never stayed at that level. So China has been accumulating, has been driving forward this push to the outside for, in fact, all the years of reform and opening up, which doesn't deny the fact that it opened up, but it matches the opening with a drive that's even more important. Even today, look at the 15 or so e-commerce pilot zones, more or less free trade zones that have been created and that are very interesting. You'll see that China's local publications and public diplomacy emphasize the fact that these zones also serve for import, and that in fact foreign companies can make a use of it, and of simplified custom regulation and a lot of other developments. But the numbers that are cited are just minuscule when you compare to the e-commerce exports that have been achieved by China. So the opening up speech remains, some of the features remain, but the bulk of the trend goes towards export. In 2025, it's interesting, Europe is not the number one, how should I call it, alternate destination for China's exports after the US is more or less, not exactly closing up, but certainly limiting access. Southeast Asia and other regions are first, but Europe comes next. And what's interesting is that the inflow of Chinese exports is now targeting the core industry or the most advanced industrial centers in Europe, precisely the member states that were having an advantage in industry that often themselves were surplus exporters. So to quote a well-known journalist who has picked up the figure recently from China Customs figure, the trade surplus towards Germany, for example, moved by 178% in 2025. That's before the end of the year. Overall, we know the press has emphasized that there is a more than $1 trillion trade surplus by China, actually for manufacturing goods, a category that's not easily defined because not everybody has the same criteria, and the IMF doesn't consider it per se, but it's a $2 trillion trade surplus. And is it really the first year today? Well, yes and no. Last year it was just 992 billion, 8 billion short. This year it's on track to arriving at a 1.1 to 1.2 trillion dollar trade surplus. That is, of course, unprecedented. Mrs. Kozłowska has stated the present. If I state the future, we're looking, if we look at the 5-year plan and coordinated development by China, to a moment when China could hope or seek to gain nearly 50% of global manufacturing production, which would be really not only unprecedented, but genuinely, thoroughly unbalanced. This is what is putting, of course, all of us, and not only Europeans, on the defensive. And we have to wonder a little why Chinese leaders have not really woken up and responded to this by deep adjustments. Of course, it's because it's a systemic difference in the economic system, and because the economic system is directly tied as well to a political system. And that explains the reluctance to do what other countries have done. China is not the first, it's of course the first on this scale to achieve this kind of unbalanced surplus, but there have been examples in East Asia before. They were much smaller, and they were with political systems that evolved and understood what's behind, what necessities are behind free trade, and the necessity to maintain what I would call the win-win system. China has emphasized a win-win policy, but in fact, it's now, as some people used to joke, but it's no longer a joke, China win twice system, and this is a real issue. We are also have to realize that China is going to become the world's largest full-set economy. It is not giving up on lower tech content or lower labor cost manufacturing output. To some extent, it's changing the frame for, let's say, give an example, textile or clothing or toys or furniture, with robotization, automation, and with remarkable, in fact, commendable schemes to improve marketing, to improve logistics, to integrate logistics. And this is how it achieves the extremely low costs that it has. It's also maintaining a very low yuan. The renminbi, as you know, moves pretty much in sync, not 100% in sync, but largely in sync with the US dollar, which is extremely convenient. You just need to buy overseas dollar-denominated assets, for example, to keep the renminbi low. And this is essentially what has been happening, because during all this time, China has been largely sterilizing the proceeds from its trade surplus by buying assets abroad. And it's now a main financial owner or lender. There are reports that it has become the first lender in the world, which is a wholly dominant situation. The second non-adjustment that China has made, and the most worrying one, is that although we should not neglect that there are transfer policies, there is redistribution in China. Let's not simplify things. Let's not say everybody who works for a factory in China is underpaid slaves. In fact, wages in China have been rising. In fact, there is a degree of social security for at least many urban-based workers, not all, and there is a big floating population, as it is called, which is different. But nonetheless, we have had price deflation. Today, December, is likely to be, if I count well, the 38th straight month of price deflation in China for manufacturing goods, the PPI, the Producer Price Index. And this is added to the devaluation of the renminbi compared to the euro, because the euro has risen compared to the dollar, and it's not the only currency that has known this trend. This is what creates a nearly impossible situation in 2025. On top of that, we have, of course, the fallout from the US-China trade controversies. Much of what China has done on rare earth, the ban, then the kind of what I would call partial lifting and one-to-one negotiation, which is still going on, both at the level of the EU and also with some member states and also with companies over individual licenses. I'm sorry to say, it amounts to blackmail for really no cause. You can't consider that the Nexperia issue, which exists, is a reason for an overall ban. You can't consider that a controversy with the US necessitates to put a complete ban on rare earth exports, as was put for some time towards Europe. This is a threat that is hanging over us, that of course, as Mrs. Kozłowska says, encourages us to diversify, but we must get rid of the threat, because this is thoroughly unacceptable. I am personally surprised that China used this weapon so soon. I thought this might be used one day, but I always believed that it would be used in case of a major international crisis. What it means is that the export surplus and open markets for China are absolutely vital to the way China's political economy is organized. And that's what constitutes a major systemic difference on top of the scale of the event for us. What are we doing in Europe? I would not go back on what Mrs. Kozłowska has said. I just position that we've been very restrained, that the EU has been extremely restrained up to now. For example, it has not used in practice the anti-coercion instrument. For example, and this is a word that figured in Mrs. Kozłowska's presentation, anti-dumping or tariffs or any kind of these measures must be justified and proportional. The proportional idea, of course, something that comes from WTO principles, but at this point, it's not necessarily very effective, as the issue of electric vehicles has shown. China will still be progressing, not only in thermal vehicles export to China, but even in electric vehicles, just because the tariffs aren't that high, certainly nowhere high compared to Canada or the US, and certainly without what I would call the customary restrictions or the legal restriction in markets such as India or Japan. So we've been actually extremely restrained, and nonetheless, restraint doesn't bring any kind of softening by China on its policies. When I look at what's happening in China today, and I'm focusing right now on e-commerce because that's something that's very much in the limelight here, I see in full swing the shift of these export waves towards higher tech content, towards moving upscale in just about every area. What is called in Chinese going from quantity to quality, but quality will not prevent quantity. It's an additional value. And of course, this speaks to the efficiency of the Chinese system in terms of production. It doesn't speak to the redistribution issue. It doesn't speak to the welfare of the population in many areas. It doesn't speak to the fact that you simply cannot own the entire global economy or replace all industrial producers by yourself. China is driving into a wall, as somebody remarked, and I would end my presentation, my short presentation, by, and that goes maybe a little, it's a little different from the accent that's been given to this conference, the issue of decoupling versus de-risking. Certainly, it's impossible, as Mrs. Kozlowska says, and as many people say, to decouple rapidly and on all fronts from China. But the experience is that China is a hard-nosed player that usually doesn't listen so much to speech, but pays attention to acts. That's what has happened. That's what's happened, by the way, between the US and China recently. The EU's main defect is that it has certainly moved forward all of its economic security policies. It's certainly moving forward, although that's not yet out of the pile, its so-called industrial accelerator, and there are currently strong debates on the issue of localization of production in Europe. But it's nowhere near as fast or nowhere near as blunt as the US has been. If I sometimes fear, because this is also a triangular game, China gives in more easily to the US on some points, and keeps a hard line in practice, not in words, because the words can be very soft, towards Europe, it will be an incitation for Europe to move to the harder line, because the softer line, or the, shall we say, the engagement and negotiation line, will have shown to have failed. So indeed, we are at a crossroads. It's a triangle. There's no hiding that the situation is difficult for the EU. China also has to wonder for itself whether it will really do without the unified single market that's up to now been the most open in the world towards Chinese exports and Chinese services. Thank you very much.
I think we can go now to Dr. Cui.
Hi. I hope that I could be helped by you, but I'm sorry, it's an online exchange. And firstly, thank you so much for this invitation, especially from SME Centre, because always, as we know, as a Chinese expert, we keep a long time, concern, observation about how about the SME in Europe, and even we are trying to look for some more opportunity, especially to promote this cooperation between SMEs between China and Europe. And also, it's my good time to meet with Mr. François Godement, my long time old friend, even not in a way of impersonal. And Yes, I heard a lot of discussion before about the China-Europe relations, and I shared some of the points from our European, friends. Uh, for example, from this madam from DigiTrade, I heard that uh, uh, you mentioned about this the relations. I mean, between China and the EU. I agree it totally, but I think that it's not only just uh, how to say indispensable relations, and I think it could be a kind of irreplaceable relations, especially for economic trade and some other. Because if we look at the current situation, I think most of the problems from China's perspective, not produced by China, and indeed, if we try to aim at some uh, certain country, uh, have to say that it's the United States. If we look at it, what happened, not only for this tariffs issue from Washington against any, I mean, major trading partner, and also even from the very new national security strategy, issued by Washington, we can find out economic instrument become the top one instrument for Washington to deal with these, strategic issues. And also, yes, I try to share some of my points and also observations with all of you, maybe from three points. Firstly, if we just look at what happened for this year, I mean 2025, what happened for China-Europe relations? I think if we try to make a conclusion for this, the situation for the whole year, uh, maybe one word for this situation, especially on the level between China and the European Union institution, is we started strong but end weak. Why? I think even as we at the very beginning, both China and the European Union, will try to do something positively. For example, because this year is a 50th anniversary for China EU diplomatic links, and also at the same time, we have to deal with this any kind of a possible impact from the second term for Trump administration. So if we look at the very beginning, both China and the European Union leaders, they try to find some common ground to deal with some challenges, and even we can find out the positive remarks by President von der Leyen on the Davos World Economy Forum. But then, yes, maybe started from April, there are some negative tendencies. One of the major problem is how about the export control by China, namely the rare earth or some other. And we find out that, yes, President von der Leyen criticized China during the G7 summit. And then there are also very big problem for the ongoing negotiation between China and the European Union on this EVs or some other trade frictions. And then, of course, at the same time, geopolitical divergences give a very negative influence on this I think mutual confidence and also mutual trust between China and the European Union. In July, when Minister Wang Yi visited Brussels, met with his counterpart in EAS, we know what happened then. It looks like both China and the European Union, they have a very big, disagreement on how could we expect the end of Ukraine crisis, and it looks like this this confrontation between Ukraine and Russia is transferring to the very, very big divergences between Europe and the and China. So I think this, frictions, this certification with some export control or some other, give some very negative impact on this, relations between China and European Union. But at the same time, especially the second half of this year, for China, it has some maybe more, how to say, optimistic reasons to believe that there is a kind of a balance of relations between China and Europe, not only just for European Union institutions, and also for some member states or even some non-member states of the European Union. If we look at what happened now for China-Spain cooperation, and also China-Norway, and also recently the visited by President Macron from France. I think now, yes, I agree with a very, very popular point now, not only for Brussels and also in Beijing, that the China-Europe relations become more and more complex. Maybe now people are talking about the some, I mean, dual tracks situation. For example, now there are two tracks between European Union institution and the member states. And we can find out some more pessimistic and predictions or situations on the level of China-EU level, because I think it's a kind of a structural, features. Because as a, how to say, as an institution, now it's looking for a balance between intergovernmental and also super national. So always to collect some more, problems or frictions or challenges in the relations with China. It has become a major job for European Union institutions. But at the same time, for most of the member states of the European Union, they are trying to get some more, even cooperation with China. If we look at what happened, for example, this year, there are increasing investment from Germany to China. Even yes, we do have some other problem with Germany. So it's a kind of the first dual track relations. Another, I think, also dual track is how could we find out a different logic between these geopolitical divergences and also economic cooperation or economic, requirement from both sides. Yes, we didn't share some, same views on Ukraine or some other, but at the same time, we do have a lot of mutual requirement, mutual demand on economic and the trade. And maybe the third one is how could we find out how to say this very, very interesting but also very difficult situation is now for China and Europe relations, we have to suffer some more pressures from outside, namely from some other major players. For example, just like what happened, European side not so satisfied with Chinese position in its relations with Russia. Similarly, China is also worrying about the this kind of cooperation or coordination between European Union and the United States. And the madam from DigiTrade take the case of the overcapacity issue. Overcapacity issue is not the first time for both European Union and the United States try to find a common ground and to deal with any challenges or frictions from China. But for China, the overcapacity, yes, maybe it's a common challenge for every economies, including China. But once European Union and the United States try to describe it as a major threat from China towards Europe, both Europe and the United States, I think it changes the logic, and also it undermines the potential cooperation between China and Europe on this regard. And also, yes, the problem is how could we deal with these challenges, and how could we, to some degree, and to repair our relations. And I understand recently within Europe some debate about the maybe now it's time for China and Europe relations is going into a turning point. I'm not sure which kind of a turning point, but mostly I find out it's full of the more pessimistic, scenarios for these relations. For example, European side always argues that you are losing the confidence about China, and you are trying to find out, China keeps a very very different, how to say, uh, 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 rhetoric on, documents, just like Mr. Godement mentioned that, okay, China keeps opening up in the speech and the documents, but in reality, China is doing something different. So I think it's an issue is mutual trust. But at the same time, I think that we should try to find out a more innovative thinking, how to deal with this current challenge, and how to even reshape our relations. Always in China, we also discussed with officials or some other UN policymakers is if it's possible for us to give a consensus enough, to give attention to the consensus enough to from European side, and especially how could we to understand the requirement of rebalance, not only for trade and also for some other industry or some a policy, some other. For example, for the EVs, if it's possible for China to have some more investment in Europe, but of course now China is facing a higher and higher requirement from European side, not only just Greenlanding investment in Europe, and also required a kind of forced transfer of technology. So I think that, yes, everything is on the table, but for both sides, I think now the big issue is if we try to repair our mutual trust, and if it's possible for us to go back to the table and to put everything on the table, and we can try to find out maybe a new format for these relations. And secondly, yes, how could we rebalance this, not only trade and also market access? I know that following this panel, we will have another discussion on Chinese 55 years plan. If we look at this 5-year plan, I think that China is starting to realize its own problem. For example, this imbalance between production and consumption. So I think for the next 5 or 10 years, China will try to deal with this challenge from less and less domestic consumptions. If we look at the GDP growth in China and also some very very imbalancing situation for different regions, we can find out China need to take some more effort to deal with this lack of consumption issue. Recently, I went to the Guangdong province, just like foreign minister of Germany did. As we know, Guangdong province used to be a top 1, GDP growth province in China, but it is not the case for recent years. I think that Guangdong province suffered a lot from this, lack of consumption, and also this very very increasingly bad situation for foreign trade, some other. So I think that we need to get some more confidence, firstly, with each other. If you look at the recent years, if you look at the self-media in China about the European economy, you can find that more and more pessimistic, scenario and very, very bad evaluation about the future of European economy. Because as a scholar, I don't accept all of these views. But if we look at the concern from European side, even for some very, very popular media, we can find a similar situation, similar pessimistic understanding about the Chinese economy. So I think now very, very big issue is how could we try to repair the mutual confidence with each other, firstly, and on the basis we can try to build up, our mutual trust. Finally, I think that how could we deal with this current situation is at the very beginning, for example, China and Europe, we have to, trapped into a kind of retaliation, exchange retaliation model to deal with some frictions. I take a note that Mr. Godement mentioned that the ACI, the possibility for European Union to take use of ACI as a pressure or instrument to force China to do something. Frankly, I think once European side has this kind of thinking, I think it will give some more evidence for Chinese side to say that okay, European Union is not taking a fair and a neutral position to deal with any trade friction or some other export control issues. Because as we know, the first time, as I observed, the European Union side talks about the possibility to take use of the ACI is before the Washington to issue the tariffs against the European Union. But after Washington had these measures, there was silence within the European Union. So which kind of behaviors or measures could be regarded as economic coercion? Is from China, is from Washington, or some other? So I think now, I don't think it's a demonstration from European Union side to talk about the possibility to take use of ACI against China now. I think it's just a demonstration of European Union lack of strategic autonomy. So, frankly, I think now it's not time to talk about the possibility for European Union to take use of ACI against China. I think now it's time for us to, discuss or to talk about that if it's possible for us to find out some more solution in a reasonable way to deal with the current situation and to, narrow down our, the gap of mutual perception and to repair our mutual confidence and then to find out more concrete solutions. For the next 5 or 10 years, China will try to develop as a so-called advanced economy. And so China will try to open up more about its market. Even I think now it's time for both China and Europe. We are talking about any possibility to help China to open up its market of servers, banking, or some other. I just finished a discussion with some Chinese bankers and also some institutional investors. They do have some similar worry or suspicions about the future, about the, the negative impact from this geopolitical tension, some other. So I think on this regard, for any SMEs both in China and Europe, and also for investors, for industries, for both sides, we do have the same consensus. We do have the same, requirement for the sustainable, mutual benefits. So I would like to stop here, and I'm glad to be part of the discussion later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of you. So we already have some questions from our audience, but since I have the pleasure to moderate this session, I will take advantage of my position and maybe kickstart the conversation with a couple of questions of my own. And I'd like to start with an easy one. Dr. Cui, you have talked in your intervention about the need to rebuild trust and the need to be approaching the bilateral EU-China relationship from a, reasonable kind of engagement focused perspective. At the same time, from a European perspective, if you look at recent developments in the past year, if you look at how China and the US have been engaging, the message is very clear, right? And the message is, at the moment, these two largest players in the world only respond to shows of force rather than engagement. So, to what degree is there a discussion within China about these perceptions in Europe and potentially in other economies of the world? And to what degree are policymakers approaching this need again to, as you say, rebuild trust with partners like the European Union through engagement? I'd like to ask the question as well to Ola and Professor Godement. What would it take to rebuild this trust from China?
Okay, thank you so much for this very, very important question. I think once we try to repair this mutual confidence and then mutual trust, we need to deal with maybe two major problems now. For example, firstly, very, very big negative impact for both China and the Europe relations. Just like I mentioned that we suffered a lot from this change or competition between other major players. And unfortunately, now for both China and Europe, we are not on the top priority for each other's policy agenda. For example, for China, yes, for a long time, the United States always very, very big and the top priority to deal with. And also for European side, United States this year, especially under Trump administration, and of course Russia, Russia and the United States also on the top priority of a policy agenda for European Union. So to a large degree, I think that's a very, very basic reason that why we could not take some serious enough about the concerns, about the requirement from other side, from each other. So I think now we need to change this situation. In China, we always try to, convince the officials or policymakers that we do have a very, very big value for these relations with Europe. Because if we look at what happened recent years, both China and Europe, we are single two, players in the world. We try to play a more constructive. We don't want to, to get some benefits by destroying something. Just like what happened for United States and also like in Russia. So we try to find out a more common, ground to play a role as, stability. Secondly, we try to change the policy agenda, even between China and Europe. How? We try to promote the priority of economic cooperation, not geopolitical competition. I'm worrying about now is if we look at what happened, especially from Brussels, it looks like some economic competition is becoming a kind of wheels of a strategic competition. So that's a very very big suspicion always from Chinese experts that once there is a likely change of the relations between China and Europe, I mean the basic logic, like what happened for the China-US relation, because nearly 10 or 15 years ago, China had some confidence about its relations with the United States, because at that time, Chinese government believed that we do share a lot of common interests economically, so there will be some, firework to stop any kind of negative tendency for any worse and worse situation for China-US relations. But now I have to say that the similar problem on the table between China and Europe. So I think now it's a time for us to strengthen our confidence that we should not let situation, I mean, now between China and Europe, become another kind of, copy of China-US relations today. I stop here.
Maybe, Ola, you want to provide the perspective?
Yes, I agree that what is missing is trust. And I must say that we have in DigiTrade witnessed an enormous goodwill, political goodwill on... Sure? Closer. On the side of my boss, Commissioner Šefčovič, because since he took his job, the frequency of his contacts with his counterpart, Minister Wang Wentao, was truly unprecedented. I haven't seen this in my almost 20-year career in the Commission. So he basically talked to Minister Wang, or they met in person almost every month. I want to give you one example. He traveled to China last week of March. He had meetings with Vice Premier He Feng. We had hours of discussions with Minister Wang on different subjects, really across the sectors. So there was a very unprecedented window of opportunity. I want to stress that this was last week of March, so this was well before the Liberation Day. And the week after he left China, introduced sweeping controls on export controls. Does it build the trust? You answer yourself. But then I want to mention also one thing. Trade relationship does not happen in a vacuum. So happens in geopolitical context. And we cannot forget that we have a war at the EU border. And we have evidence that China is one of the enablers of this war. We have evidence that Chinese companies has been supplying parts, components of little weapons to Russia. This is reflected in different sanctions packages. This does not build trust between the EU and China geopolitically, but also more narrowly in a trade context. Thank you.
Professor Godement?
Yes, very quickly. The question of trust sounds like the easiest one. In fact, it's the toughest. And I think Mrs. Koslowska has approached it from the point of view which is logical, direct, top-level talks, which is important. But the context is also hugely important. There's no denying that US positions, including their unpredictability, are a factor and a problem. I'm not going to dwell a lot into that because it's not the issue of the day, but of course it influences us. But from the point of view of relations with China, there are two important consequences. Europe constantly runs the risk of being a market of last resort for Chinese exports, which have been prevented one way or another from flowing to the US. Okay, there is some transshipment, probably, but still. And therefore, we just simply cannot stand still in this world. And I note, this may be controversial there to Hongjian, but that China seems to have celebrated a victory after the US after the Busan meeting, when in fact it's still hit with some pretty significant tariffs by the US. The only satisfaction, of course, is that up to now the US has introduced even higher tariffs to India, which is simply incomprehensible from a geopolitical point of view. But that's the reality, and we therefore have to worry about who does China pay attention to mainly. I know that coming back on the rare earth issue and the export denial issues in high tech, which we can put side to side, there have been indeed export denials, and there is something that's being considered in the name of economic security by their opinion on a number of sectors. But the Nexperia case is just one case in point. It's interesting to note that the Netherlands trade statistics are not the world's finest with China because there's so much transshipment to other European countries that they're not wholly significant of the Dutch economy. But still, it's the only country that nearly hasn't had a rise in its trade deficit with China so far in 2025. So things are not consistent with the notion of export denial. In fact, it's the load of chips coming from the Netherlands that has in part constituted this situation and avoided a larger trade surplus. So I think the rare earth answer by China is a wholly uncalled for, is a kind of sweeping threat hanging over many partners. And it's something that people will unavoidably have to face. So the issue of trust is pretty much there. I want to note before we move on to something else, Dr. Hongjian, that I was deeply appreciative of your, I would say, recognition of the balancing problem of the consumption issue and of some steps that are being taken in China currently. These steps, in my view, are minimal at this point, but they exist, and it's really a question of time before they become an absolute necessity because the exports cannot grow to the sky. Right now, they provide a good amount of China's growth. It cannot continue that way, whatever we do or whatever we don't do.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe continuing on the topic of again how we build trust. I want to focus on the specific economic, trade and investment relationship. We have seen this year that basically a lot of the conversation between the EU and China has been absorbed by export controls and the challenges related to export controls that European companies are facing still at the moment. We have also seen that again, I guess partly because export controls has taken so much of the air in the bilateral economic relationship. For instance, there hasn't really been a high-level economic and trade dialogue this year. So my question is, from again this trade and investment perspective, are there any so-called low-hanging fruits that China could maybe agree to provide in terms of that could go some way towards again rebuilding this trust? To me, again, I have been working a lot on export control, so just further streamlining this process would be one that is pretty evident. But I'd like to hear the perspective both from the European side. So, what kind of low-hanging fruits are there for the European side, but also on the Chinese side?
Well, these low-hanging fruits are not so hanging so low anymore. But of course they are. They are, and in our understanding, some of these asks that, for example, Commissioner Šefčovič brought with him and presented to Minister Wang in March are relatively easy for China to grant. They all concern market access, because this is the start of rebalancing of economic relationship. So we are talking here about the sectors of pharmaceuticals, we are talking about cosmetics, we are talking about meat exports, dairy, brandy. So in our understanding, these are relatively easy asks. So far, we have not seen so much interest and engagement from the Chinese side, but our asks are still there. So if there is a goodwill on Chinese side, we are ready to engage. I want to repeat what I said before. So apart from high-level engagement between Commissioner and Minister Wang, there had been an avalanche of technical talks exactly on these sectors, on pharma, on cosmetics, on agri-food exports. Unfortunately, without success, but I still personally regard them as this kind of low-hanging fruit. Is export control a low-hanging fruit? I have my doubts here. So far, the fast-track licensing, I would say, greatly delivered, because the success rate, depending who you ask, is around 70, maybe 80%. But still, remember, we are talking about fast track, so we are not having an overview of all licensing requirements. Now, moving from last week to general licenses, and I know that I think 3 Chinese companies already got general licenses. Covering export also to European companies is definitely a step in right direction. So if China is willing to continue meeting low-hanging fruits from the EU, this is one of the avenues to go.
Professor Godement, maybe you want to add?
I would add, and I recognize that pragmatically what Mrs. Kosowska has said is absolutely what we must do in the short term. But I think this raises a longer term issue, which is when China is faced with negotiating problems, it often creates what I call mobile obstacles that it can then slowly remove one by one, negotiating with member states often rather than with the EU. Mr. Šefčovič is indeed taking a forward role, but nonetheless, individual member states and companies are being put on the spot. This is, after all, what has happened for much more mundane products, such as, meat and meat products over the year. And the novelty, of course, is that China applies this to the most important issue, or the most burning issue you could find. I want to emphasize these are perhaps not low-hanging fruits, but they're important. Something that I called in a paper, and which other people call the so-called Deng Xiaoping in reverse. The localization in Europe of production instead of exports, which is something Hongjian has also alluded to. And dear Hongjian, this gets criticism from nearly every side. From hardliners who say, come on, we'll never be able to implement localization criteria. We'll never be able to get technology transfer. We're not the CCP. We don't have the judicial system that China has. And China knows so well how it benefited from the original JV system. It has not even renounced it. It's very hard now to get 100% subsidiary in China. So that's one line of argument. The other line of argument is this is beneath us. We need to compete purely positively. And of course, China has no reason per se outside of a negotiation to give in to any kind of localizations or content requirement or transfer requirement criteria. Nonetheless, I think it's a logical track to follow. On the rare earth issue, which I think is almost is as important or more important in the short term. Look, you are providing help to drone manufacturers in Russia. You even have an investor who is taking a stake in a drone manufacturing company. That's okay, indirect aid, not exactly exporting weapons to Russia, but very nearly so, and quite important given the advance of the Chinese system. Why don't you concede that granting, opening more directly rare earth export to China, not bargaining one by one, would be a positive step, given the fact, for example, that rare earths go into defense industry and are hugely important also for European defense. You're sharp enough to note the kind of debates we have with the US currently, and I'm not going to bring it up here, but there is also huge issues in terms of arms procurements and weapons industry and what happens. And when you speak sometimes of the goal, I mean not you personally, but the Chinese spokesman speak of the need to somehow de-link the US from the EU from the US. I think it's important that China, on the contrary, does not create and push those very links by its own actions. So these are not exactly low-hanging fruits, but these could be fruits of opportunity. I think there have been proposals floating on those issues which China might want to consider.
Dr. Cui, what are China's low-hanging fruits?
Thank you so much for all of the discussion. A very interesting exchange. But I would like to have some response for some views for our European participants. Firstly, yes, perhaps there are some, feeling about now China become more and more difficult to get along with, and now it will cost more and more once both China and Europe will try to reach agreement. I agree with it. I think it's not just the issue between China and Europe, because also the paradigm of the world, especially logic of international order, is going, changing. So I think now we have to be familiar with maybe new normal situation, not only just because between China and Europe, maybe between some other partners or even countries. They have to deal with higher and higher cost to reach any kind of agreement. I heard a story from a mother about not so happy exchange with your counterparty in China, I mean Ministry of Commerce. And even in MFA of China about the also unhappy story when Minister Wang visited Brussels this July. So I think firstly, yes, we should have some more ambition to try to change the situation, to change the environment. But of course, at the same time, we have to be more, pragmatic to understand what's the situation. So firstly, I want to say we need to manage our expectation. And a very, very realistic situation is because so far, especially for China-Europe relations, just like what we talk about, now the major job for European side is to, establish a kind of strategic autonomy. I do believe that for China-Europe relations, we also need to finish the job to have some more strategic autonomy, especially when we are facing the pressure from Washington, from Moscow. Second, about this, how about the position, how about the policy of China towards this Ukrainian crisis? I understand what's the very, very different understanding from European side on Chinese behaviors, Chinese position. But I just want to remind, a fact. So far, not only China, yes, is the biggest trading partner with Russia, and China is also biggest trading partner with Ukraine. Okay, so I hope that especially for European media, it could not just take some selective message or information about this situation and just try to describe China as the closest partner or even an ally with Russia. I think it's out of the fact. And also maybe you don't believe that because China has a general export control about John to both Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, Chinese government, not government, Chinese administration arrested and punished some people who violate the mission and to export John to Russia. It's a fact, but it could not be a story, especially on the European newspaper or media, because so I'm not sure that why always European side try to describe China as a close, ally with Russia, and finally, I think that yes, we need to manage. We need to try to manage these divergences or even competitions. So I think now the big issue is, frankly, if we could find out a kind of a transactional list. I mean, we do have some problem, for example, requirements from the European side on the rare earth or some other, and also requirement from China on e-waves or some other. So a very, very pragmatic, I think the solution is, if it's possible for us to find out the package of solution that we can exchange some, interests and to find out a more, stable foundation, or even to find out to develop our resilience in the current situation, and perhaps maybe in the near future. Even I don't think that China will take use of the instrument of export control increasingly, because there will be some, diminution boundary unit of this so-called export control. Because once there are some more measures taken by China on export control, certainly there will be some more response from outside, from the international market. So we are also trying to convince Chinese officials that, okay, for temporary use or for some technical reason, you can take use of these measures, but it could not be a long-term and also, how to say, increasingly use instrument. I hope that our European friend has similar understanding about once you try to take use some instrument like ACI or some other, it's not just especially the result or the consequences will not be in your interest finally. Also, will not be in the expectations finally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to open the floor for questions from our audience, but maybe while you think about the questions, we have actually a question online, and it relates, of course, to export controls. And indeed, you rightly said, Dr. Cui, that the imposition of export controls by China is very likely going to elicit responses. And the question is, from a policy perspective, what kind of responses are we talking about at the Commission level on, again, export controls on rare earth elements and, of course, on the Nexperia situation, which are slightly different but related?
Sure. I don't think that we should expect any response from the Commission. Our goal is to engage and to get the licenses, to get the trade in rare earths flowing, and this has delivered. So the Commission talks to Minister Wang almost every month. They talk in October, they talked last week of November. Nexperia case and export controls are central in the discussions. But it's not only that. It's not only at political level, because there are also technical discussions going on almost every week or every 2 weeks. We discuss different batches of priority licenses. We discuss the future of general licenses. So I wouldn't expect a nuclear bomb from the Commission. On the contrary, excuse me, engagement delivers greatly in export controls, thanks to engagement at political level. So this is the way. This is the way to go. I wouldn't expect any. I don't know what the question was about exactly, but if the question was about retaliation, I wouldn't expect this from the Commission. On the contrary, we are for the free flow of rare earths, including from China.
Okay. Questions from our audience? Philippa? Can you?
I have a question that isn't a specific question about this, but it's a question about the whole discussion. And we keep talking about consumption and the problem in China being need to rebalance and the need to develop consumption. What I wondered if Professor Godement and Professor Cui could help us understand is, what is the definition of consumption? I feel that this is misunderstood because Beijing seems to understand consumption in a very different way to us and to market economies.
Professor Godement, I think this one's for you. And of course, Dr. Cui, if you want to respond also from the Chinese perspective.
Well, that's right. I was going to say that there's obviously a Chinese angle on defining those issues. From what I see, China doesn't have the usual definitions, neither for consumption nor for savings. I alluded to that. Savings as such is not a category that exists. It's a category that dumps together cash flow and reserves by companies and household savings. Consumptions, from our perspective, certainly does not include negative, what I would call negative consumption or negative saving. For example, if you get a lot of subsidized public housing at a very low cost, you could argue that it is consumption, in fact. And I guess we certainly wouldn't count that as consumption, but there is a tendency among economists to disagree on the actual very low percentage of Chinese household consumption that's usually mentioned because of this public housing subsidy factor. That's one thing. Then you have, I think, something else, which is really, really very important, which is what you would call compelled savings, compulsory savings, in part because of low interest rate. That has changed, by the way, a little. And the interest rates in China are actually higher than they were, and they do push towards savings as well today, particularly if you match it with deflation. It's the low interest trap, deflation trap that Japan once knew and which China knows today at a larger scale. So I agree completely with something that Hongjian said in passing when he mentioned Guangdong, which is not everything is rosy on the internal front, and that in a way these two factors, the export factor and the inside domestic, I wouldn't call it a slump because, you know, even when China stagnates, even if you're skeptical about some growth numbers, it's still not zero. It's still above zero, but with very different distributive results. That's all I can say, but it's possible that Hongjian has a better definition than I have on consumption.
Okay, yes, I'm not sure I will have a better definition about the consumption, but I think consumption is a consumption. But I think that maybe the different situation for China and Europe is, as we know, for the past 10 years, I think a very maybe big change is less and less personal consumption in China, because not only because of the COVID-19, I think COVID-19 still has some negative impact on people's confidence to have some more consumption. Another, I think, important reason is also in the recent years, China is trying to change its policy on some, for example, real estate, and now it also give some impact on people's confidence about, okay, we need to pay something more, we need to have some more consumption. And even recent years, China also changes its policy on so-called social consumption or public consumption. If you look at some new discipline by CCP, now it also gives some I think temporary some negative impact on this confidence of social or under personal consumption. But I think now, if we look at the 15th five-year plan, I think Chinese government started to realize the problem. So for the next 5 or 10 years, and China will try to, to maybe not just go back, but China will try to find out a new balance between this production and the consumption, especially to promote some more confidence for personal consumption. Recently, I visited the Hainan province. As we know, in another 1 week, China will have its so-called Hainan Free Trade Port. I think it's a kind of a new test for how to promote the personal consumption and also how to stimulate the consumption for enterprises or industries. So I think China is trying to change the situation. Thank you.
Yes, another question from our audience. I will ask, so we're already eating into our coffee break time. I think that we can extend 5 to 10 minutes. And in order to make sure that we answer as many questions from our audience as possible, I'll ask our speakers to keep it brief. So, Jacob.
Yes. Sorry, I'm also going to ask about the export controls. So the rare earth export controls, the fast track and the dialogue that has been developed, we're here at the EU SME Centre event. I'm curious if European SMEs have been as successful in being able to obtain even the 70 or 80% that maybe some of the larger companies have been able to obtain. And also a more general question on these export controls. The export controls that were introduced in October, the kind of massive increase in long-arm jurisdiction export controls that were then reversed as a result of US escalation in order to de-escalate, this seems to have solved the problem there. And I wonder what lessons should Europe be thinking about if the US is able to get the rare earth controls removed that it needs by escalation, but the European Union is only able to get 70 or 80% of what they need through dialogue. What kind of message is Beijing sending with that strategy?
Thank you, Jacob. Always easy questions from you coming. On the share of SMEs, we don't know because we don't do the statistics. We have an IT tool through which companies give us information about their application, and this is how we operate. So unfortunately, I'm not able to give you the answer how many of those that got the fast track are really SMEs. I don't think that we have this statistics. Now, for the lessons, not sure at which moment you came. Maybe not from the very beginning when I was speaking. We don't want to portray the EU as unpredictable trade partner, because we are not an unpredictable trade partner. On the contrary, in the world of unpredictability, we are a predictable and stable partner. That's why we developed this amazing networks of different agreements around the globe. Now I think we have something like 80 different agreements, not only FTAs but also more comprehensive different agreements. So what lessons? If I repeat my answer before, if you expect that the EU will easily retaliate in export controls by, I don't know, restricting our own exports or restricting access to certain goods to the EU market, we are not yet there. Of course, these possibilities exist. It would be naive not to believe that we don't have possibility to use the choke points that we have on China, we have on the US, on other trading partners. But this is not the way we want to go. We still believe in open trade. I think now 30 million people in the EU depend on trade. So this is not the way that we will go. And this is, I think, one of the important lessons that that we have. For us, it's maybe not something super new, but this is the message that we want to send to the world, that the EU is predictable. EU will not act as the US, EU will not act as China, because we depend on trade, we believe in free trade, and we expand our trade network.
Maybe I will ask Dr. Cui to also provide the Chinese perspective on this, because again, is there a conversation in China regarding the perception that the only conversation that will yield results is going to be force?
Mm-hmm. I think now the very big problem now for these major players, including, I mean, for both China and the US, both China and Europe, I think now we need to stop any kind of tendencies and a kind of how to say monument to have this retaliation and to play some more cards, and even to maybe in a hybrid way to deal with some competition. For example, I think that for both China and Europe, if we try to find out a solution that we just take the rare earth or some other economic issue, go back to the economic thinking or economic logic, I think that could be very, very big victory for us to deal with this, very big attraction, especially, raised by United States, that it has a comprehensive instrument. And once you will not give up for economic issue, yes, I will give you some other punishment from security or some other. So I think what we could do now is we also try to keep a rebalance between economic issue, security issue, some geopolitical issue. We need to try to separate from a kind of a mixture situation for all of this issue on the same package. So that's the reason why I always mention that once we try to have some more positive scenario for future, both China and Europe, we need to rethink about what's a very, very big experience for us for the past more than 40 years. How could we try to get some, cooperation. I think a very, very big experience is we try to separate between those political issue and economic issue or even security issue. But of course, I understand that maybe the single consensus for us now is we could not go back to the past easily. But we try to, keep this resilience, especially to find out the continuity between the past experience and the current solution and even the future, scenario. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have several questions from our audience online and not a lot of time. So maybe I will ask one question. We also have another question about how SMEs should deal with supply chain related uncertainties that I think we can cover in our future session this afternoon on supply chains. But maybe for the purpose of this session, one question is, from the European perspective, China is able to access the single market very easily, but the 27 member states basically are in a position where they have to negotiate, or they are negotiating kind of individual deals to increase market access in areas, for instance, agricultural goods and so on and so forth. And the question here is, to what degree would there be an appetite for an EU-China deal similar to the US-China phase 1 deal?
It's for me, right?
It's for everybody.
Okay, I start. The ask from the EU 27 to Chinese counterparts to give us more of the China pie has always been there. So this is not something that we invented recently. Our access to the Chinese market, instead of growing, is shrinking. Our exports are dropping. So this aspect, this idea has always been there. Now, is an example of phase 1 deal a good one? Not necessarily. I don't think this was a very successful attempt. I must admit I have not tracked the latest, but I think the assessment is ongoing, if I'm not mistaken, by our American friends. China has not fulfilled the obligations from phase 1, so not sure that this should be the avenue that the EU goes. I maybe stop here. If China is willing to open its market to the EU products, even better for us. Not sure how we could reciprocate, because if you sign any deal, it should be based on reciprocity. So I don't know how we can be more open to Chinese export. Chinese exports across the sectors are coming. It's an avalanche. You name the sector, subsector. So it's always a question of how attractive this kind of deal would be for both parts. We were waiting for the success of phase 1, then we are waiting for phase 2. Maybe now people also talk about purchase commitments in a kind of a deal between EU, the US and China. But this is not happening. The reality is different. China is not opening. China is closing. Not sure there is still a window of opportunity for this kind of purchase commitments deals. But I'm curious about how this looks from Chinese perspective. Would that be something interesting?
Yes. May I have a very short response? I think now, yes, a very, very big problem for this mutual perception. just like a model mentioned, maybe now from a European perspective, China is not opening, China is closing. Interesting thing that now from Chinese side, we do have a similar judgment about Europe, which means that Europe is closing and Europe is not opening. So I think now, how could we understand this reciprocity? If European side think that okay, because China used to have this kind of transfer of technology policies, so now it's time for European side to use the same policy to deal with competition from China. Yes, it's a reciprocity, but because Europe is more open than China before. So once now European side try to get a reciprocal treatment from China, so which means that Europe will keep closing and closing, and then to force China to keep open and open. So I think that's the situation. How could we understand who is closing and who is open? Another, I think now what we need to do is we need to try to extend our list of trade trading. For example, we mentioned that agri-food. Recent years, China imports a lot of imported a lot of agricultural production and food from European countries. And another, I think, very big issue is how could China and Europe we can have some more cooperation in a complementary way in some third market. For example, in Africa, even in Latin America. Of course, maybe in future there will be not a space in Latin America because it will become the part of the United States. But anyway, I think that Africa or some other third market could be very, very important and also potential opportunity for both China and Europe, not only just to change the situation of competition, and even we can find out some more opportunity of cooperation.
Professor Godement?
Yeah, a few quick points. I don't think Europe is closing. I mean, the available stats, from 21 to 24, 2021 to 2024, exports in value to Europe increased by 27%. Estimates about volume, say 41%. I'm not sure about them, but that's probably on that scale. Export from the EU to China plus 1%. For 2025, it'll be close to 10% in one direction from China to Europe and between 1 and 2% in the other direction. So Europe really is not closing. But in the virtual question that you mentioned, it was not only about a wide trade agreement, it was about specific agreements. The example of GIO, geographical indications of origin, was given. I want to come back to that because that was indeed it's the one and only positive agreement that I can cite. Others were remedies for what I call mobile obstacles that China had placed. And in the case of GIO, look closely at the Trump 1 agreement, trade agreement with China. There was what you could call a poison pill inside that trade agreement, asking China, requiring China to submit to the US any kind of agreement they concluded on geographical indications of origin. So here it is, we're in a triangular game. This was very favorable to both. I gather that China has been using the GIO also and is developing its own brands, including for very local products, thanks to that. I would then say, yes, there is something that could come. European firms in China sometimes were given the motto, or they themselves said, in China for China. Hugely important for Chinese firms in Europe to say in Europe for Europe. And that's the delocalization agreement. Now, how do we say in English? Our violins are not yet fully coordinated on this inside the EU, which is perhaps why Digitrade doesn't emphasize it at this point. It's still under negotiation under the industrial accelerator. But it's an important issue, and it would be a very important agreement that is not equivalent to full free trade, wide open. I don't think this era makes full free trade agreements very possible between either the US, China, and the EU, maybe with third parties, but not among ourselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to thank our three speakers for the very, very stimulating conversation. We have introduced a number of threats, including consumption, including geopolitics, including de-risking, and including supply chains and supply chain strategies that I'm happy to report will be covered more extensively in the coming sessions, so stay tuned. And yeah, I guess in the meantime, we go for a coffee break. Thank you very much.